All right, so imagine this, right? You're at a dinner party, and somehow it always seems to happen, right? The conversation turns to immigration policy. Everyone's got an opinion, but it feels like, I don't know, trying to solve one of those jigsaw puzzles where, like, half the pieces are missing. Where do you even start with something that complex? Well, that's kind of where our deep dive comes in today. We're going to be exploring this article that tackles immigration, but from a perspective you might not expect. Get this, we're bringing in Aristotle, Thomas Jefferson, even the Roman Empire. Yeah, you heard that right. The article is called The Role of Immigration in Politics, Lessons from Aristotle and Jefferson. And right away, it kind of throws down this challenge, you know? It basically says before we even talk about any immigration policies, we got to figure out what the state is for.
It's like, I don't know, trying to fix traffic without knowing if your city even wants cars or bikes to have priority, right? We're busy debating solutions before we even know our destination.
Exactly. The article's really arguing that a state's most important job is to make sure its citizens can thrive, like really flourish. It's not just about getting by, it's about building a place where people can reach their full potential.
Okay, so we're talking about quality of life, not just survival, right? And they use a really interesting word to describe a state that gets that right, virtuous. It's almost like they're making a moral judgment about the government itself.
Yeah, you could say that. The article definitely argues that a state has a moral obligation to put its citizens first. And that's where they make these, well, kind of striking comparisons. They actually compare some modern governments to, get this, abusive relationships.
Yeah, that definitely jumped out at me. They're saying citizens are being gaslit into accepting policies that end up hurting them in the end. Is that going too far, or is that a fair comparison, you think?
It's definitely meant to be provocative. I think what they're trying to highlight here is this disconnect between what they see as the true purpose of a state and how some policies actually play out in reality. Whether or not you agree with the whole gaslighting thing, it makes you ask, who's actually benefiting from these policies and at what cost? And that brings us right back to immigration.
Because if a flourishing citizenry is the goal, right, shouldn't we be looking at immigration policies through that lens too?
Exactly, yeah. And that's where they bring in these two big ideas, civic virtue and social cohesion.
Okay, before we go any further, can we define those? Because they kind of sound like, jargony academic terms. What do they actually mean for everyday people?
You're right. We don't want to get stuck in the weeds. So civic virtue is basically the idea that citizens are actively participating in their society for the common good.
Right.
It's not just about, what's in it for them personally. It's about being invested in your community and how well it's doing.
So, that sense of shared purpose, working together for something bigger than yourself?
Exactly. And that's where social cohesion comes in. That's the glue. It's what holds it all together. That feeling of belonging,
Yeah.
right? Shared values, goals, it binds a community together.
Mm.
Makes people want to work together, build something that lasts.
Which makes sense, right? When everyone's on the same page, things tend to work a little more smoothly. But then the article throws a bit of a curveball, you know? It says that mass immigration can sometimes mess with that cohesion. Is that always true? How do newcomers become a part of that shared purpose, the one the article's talking about?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And honestly, there's no simple answer. The article looks at some examples from history, but every wave of immigration is different, shaped by its own situation.
Right, it's not like we can just, slap a one-size-fits-all answer on this.
Nope. But they offer some interesting ideas looking at, you guessed it, Aristotle and Jefferson. Both of them, really big believers in active citizenship. And to them, that wasn't just, paying your taxes and following the law. It was about understanding and actually contributing to the shared values of the state.
So how do we translate that to immigration now, in the 21st century, I mean?
Well, the article argues that successful integration, it's not just about economic opportunity, even though that's important, of course. It's also about really understanding and embracing even those shared values,
Yeah.
the core principles that a society is built on.
So it's not about erasing those differences, but finding common ground, building something new while still respecting where everyone came from.
You got it. And that takes time and effort and a real willingness to engage with those differences, not just try to avoid them. Which brings us to another thing they bring up, and this one's a little harder to hear, maybe the Roman Empire.
Ah, yes, the classic cautionary tale. Basically saying that Rome, the Republic, at least its collapse can partly be traced back to mass immigration. Too many newcomers, not enough social cohesion, and boom, the whole system falls apart.
It's definitely a dramatic example, and they're using it to make a point for sure. But we got to remember, the fall of Rome, super complicated, lots of factors. To just blame it on immigration,
Yeah.
it's, yeah, way too simplistic.
So let's unpack that a little. The article kind of paints this picture of Rome being overrun, like their systems just couldn't handle all those people coming in. Was it really that simple, though?
History is really simple.
Oh.
Yeah, there was a lot of migration from the territories they conquered, and that definitely put stress on their systems, their institutions. But there are other things going on, too. Internal power struggles, economic stuff, military overreach, all of that played a part in the empire's decline.
So it's more nuanced than just Rome had too many immigrants and collapsed.
Exactly. I think what they're trying to show is the potential downsides of mass immigration, which, yeah, we should think about, especially in light of a state's responsibility to its citizens, right? But we got to be careful about those easy historical comparisons. The Roman Empire isn't the modern world.
Like trying to diagnose someone based on one symptom, right? You need the full picture. And speaking of missing pieces, they spend some time on something we hear all the time these days: the middle class.
Yeah. They make a pretty strong argument that a strong middle class is, like, essential for a stable democracy for it to really work.
Which, I mean, you hear that everywhere. But how does that tie back into immigration? According to the article, I mean.
So their argument is that uncontrolled immigration, especially when you've got things like, I don't know, growing wealth inequality happening at the same time, all of that can actually make the middle class smaller.
Okay.
They're suggesting that if you have tons of people coming in,
Uh-huh.
and they're mostly competing for those lower wage jobs, it can push wages down for everyone. And that makes it harder for the existing middle class to stay afloat, to maintain their living standard.
So it's not just the economic impact on the new arrivals, but this ripple effect it can have on like the whole social and economic fabric of a place.
Exactly. And they bring up, believe it or not, the Roman Empire again. They talk about the influx of slaves and, just cheap labor during the late Republic and how that ended up hurting Roman citizens economically.
Interesting. But couldn't you argue that in a lot of cases, newcomers can actually be good for the economy? I mean, they create new businesses, they fill jobs that are empty, they bring in new skills, new ways of thinking about things.
100%. And that's a huge part of this whole discussion that often gets left out. Immigration's effect on the economy is complicated. It's not like all good or all bad, and how those impacts shake out, who benefits and who doesn't, really depends on how the whole thing is managed.
So not exactly a clear-cut issue then. We've covered a lot: history, philosophy, economics. For anyone listening who's like feeling a little overwhelmed right now, I feel you. What's the big takeaway here? What's the core message this article really wants us thinking about?
I think the best thing about this article is that it kind of forces us to move past those usual talking points, those same old arguments we hear all the time, right? Like, it reminds us that immigration policy isn't just about the numbers. It's about values, the kind of society we actually want, and how immigration either helps or, maybe even hurts us get there.
It's like that idea we keep coming back to: a state's purpose,
Yeah.
that responsibility it has to its citizens. This article really makes you wonder if how we're doing things now really lines up with those ideals.
Exactly. It's not an easy question to answer, is it?
Yeah.
But it's one we can't just ignore. And honestly, it's something each of us has to kind of wrestle with on our own, too. Not just something we leave up to, the policymakers.
So, okay, let's say like Aristotle and Jefferson, right? They just magically show up in 2024 and we hand them this article. What do you think they'd say about this whole debate?
Oh, man, that's a good one. I can just picture them going back and forth about it. Now, they were both really deep thinkers, but they didn't always agree. But knowing their philosophies, I think they'd probably push us to think beyond just the economic impact of immigration, the good and the bad. I think they'd be asking us to consider, like, the long-term effects on that civic virtue we talked about, how it impacts social cohesion, the overall health of the state, all of it.
They'd want us to find that balance, right? Where we're welcoming new people, creating a more inclusive society, but also being smart about the challenges, making sure everyone benefits down the road.
Exactly. And they definitely remind us that there are no easy answers, no one solution that fits everywhere, every time. They might even say that the most important thing is to just keep asking these tough questions, keep the conversation going.
To keep learning, keep listening to each other. Which is what this whole deep dive is about, right? Like, this isn't the end of the conversation. It's more like the beginning.
100%. And I really hope everyone listening will take that to heart. Don't just take our word for it or even the articles. Go out there, do your own deep dives, find different viewpoints, look at the historical side of things, and most importantly, form your own opinions. informed ones.
That's what being an engaged citizen is all about, right? Taking an active role in shaping the world around you. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one sparking those thought-provoking conversations at your next dinner party. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, and until next time, happy exploring.